At San Carlos in 1883, a government agent told an Apache man to send his second wife away or his family would not eat. The woman they wanted gone had built her own wickiup. She stored the food that held the household together. She had been chosen by the first wife's mother. In the world she came from, she could have ended the marriage any morning she wanted. Now, a man behind a desk was ending it for her. Was the life she lost the one the movies showed you, or something Hollywood never had the nerve to tell? To understand what a second wife actually was in an Apache marriage, you have to forget everything the movies told you about how Apache families worked. Start with the ground itself. When an Apache man married a woman, he did not bring her home to his people. He left his people. He walked to her camp and moved in among her family. Her mother, her sisters, her aunts. His hunting, his raiding, his fighting, all of it now served her family, not his own. This was not some unusual arrangement reserved for certain bands or certain decades. It was the bedrock of Apache social life across the Chiricahua, the Western Apache, and the Mescalero. The physical layout of the camp told you everything. The wife's mother's dwelling sat at the center of the family cluster. Around it, spaced close but separate, stood the wickiups of her daughters and their husbands. A newly married man arriving in this circle was the outsider. He knew it. Everyone knew it. He walked into a world already organized, already running, already governed by women who had lived together their whole lives. He had to prove his usefulness before he earned his place. And there was a rule that made his position even more precarious, a rule that shaped every hour of his daily life in that camp. The mother-in-law avoidance taboo was one of the most rigidly enforced customs in all of Apache life. A husband could not look directly at his wife's mother. He could not speak to her. He could not sit in the same enclosed space with her. If she walked toward him on a path, he stepped off it. If she entered the wickiup, he left before she reached the door. If he was eating and she approached, he put the food down and moved. This was not a suggestion. It was not a gentle social custom that people sometimes bent. Violation brought real consequences, the kind of public shame that could mark a man in the eyes of the whole camp for years. Think about what that meant in practice. The wife's mother controlled the entire domestic world her son-in-law inhabited. She decided how the camp was arranged, which daughters lived nearest to her, how food and labor were shared between the family wickiups. She determined the rhythm of daily life for everyone in her circle. She could make her son-in-law's days smooth and comfortable, or she could make them quietly unbearable, and she never had to say a single word to him to accomplish either one. The husband was not the authority in that home. He was a guest who kept his place by being useful and who understood every waking minute that the ground under his feet belonged to someone else. Every claim in this video comes from the testimony of Apache people themselves. Morris Opler spent years in the 1930s sitting with elderly Chiricahua men and women who still remembered the old ways. They told him how marriages were made, how households ran, how disputes were settled, and he published what they said in a book called An Apache Life Way in 1941. Grenville Goodwin documented Western Apache camps and family structures in the same era, working from the inside with informants who trusted him enough to explain what outsiders always got wrong. He published his findings in 1942. Eve Ball sat with Mescalero elders for decades, recording memories that stretched back to the wars and the flight and the years before the reservation. She published those voices in 1980. And Geronimo himself dictated his own story through a translator in 1906, the year before he died at Fort Sill, still a prisoner of war. These are the sources. Where they agree, and they agree on the big things, we are standing on solid ground. Where they are thin or contradictory, I will tell you so. And where Hollywood invented something out of nothing, I will show you exactly what they made up and what the people who were actually there had to say about it. Now the question that matters: why would a man take a second wife at all? The answer the movies gave you was power. A chief with many wives, a warrior collecting women like horses. The real answer was nothing like that. It was labor. The domestic economy of an Apache camp was one of the most demanding ways of life on the continent. Processing a single deer hide meant days of scraping, soaking, and stretching until the skin was soft enough to sew into clothing or shelter. The hide had to be staked out, scraped clean of flesh and fat, soaked in a solution made from the animal's own brain, then worked and pulled by hand until it went from stiff, rawhide to something a person could wear. One hide, days of work. A good hunter might bring home several in a single week. Gathering mescal was no lighter. The women hiked to where the agave grew, dug the heavy crowns from rocky ground, hauled them back, and roasted them in stone-lined pits for 2 or 3 days. Then came the pounding and drying. Beyond that, there was meat to smoke before it spoiled, tiswan to brew, seeds and berries to collect and store, water to haul from the nearest stream, sometimes a long walk over rough ground. The wickiup needed constant repair, especially after storms in the higher elevations where many bands camped. This was not occasional work. This was every single day. And a successful hunter created a problem that had nothing to do with vanity. He brought home more raw material than one wife could process. Meat spoiled before it could be dried. Hides stiffened because there were not enough hands to work them in time. A surplus that should have fed a family through winter was wasted because the labor of preserving it outpaced one woman's waking hours. A second wife was not a luxury. She was the margin between a family that stored enough food for the cold months and one that ran out by February. Here is the part the movies never showed. The most common form of Apache second marriage was sororal polygyny. The second wife was the first wife's own sister. This was not merely a preference. It was the expected practice among the Chiricahua and Western Apache alike. Opler's informants explained it plainly. Sisters already knew how to share a camp. They had grown up dividing labor between the same wickiups. They shared a mother who oversaw the household and settled disputes before they grew. Bringing a stranger into a marriage introduced friction and the real risk of splitting the household. Marrying a sister kept the work flowing and the peace intact. The decision did not belong to the husband. The first wife's family chose the second wife. Her mother and father evaluated whether another daughter should join, whether the man deserved it, whether the labor justified it. The husband did not go looking. The women and their mother decided when another pair of hands was needed and whose hands those would be. Look at Geronimo's own life. In the summer of 1850, Mexican soldiers under Colonel Carrasco attacked the Apache camp near Llanos. They killed his first wife, Alope. They killed his 3 small children. They killed his mother. Geronimo came back from a trading trip to find everything gone. After that devastation, he married Chi-hash-kish and later took another wife, Nana-thuth-teeth, while Chi-hash-kish was still living. He married several times across his shattered life, and more than once he had 2 wives at the same time. Now hold that and consider the white frontier wife of the same decade. In 1850, a white woman in Missouri or Texas breaking under the weight of a homestead had no structured way to bring another woman into the household to share the burden. Her husband could not take a second wife. The law forbade it, so the labor fell on her, or on children barely old enough to lift a bucket, or on nobody. The Apache system looked at that same problem and solved it with a transparent, family-regulated structure. The white frontier had exactly the same problem and offered nothing. Now, here is where this story turns into something the movies could never have shown because it would have shattered every assumption their audience brought into the theater. The second wife owned her dwelling. She owned everything inside it. The wickiup and its contents belonged to the woman who built it. In a plural marriage, each wife had her own separate wickiup. The husband moved between them. He was the one without a fixed home. If the marriage ended, he left with what he had brought, which was usually almost nothing. The stored food stayed. The tools stayed. The hides, the dried meat she had spent weeks preparing, all of it remained with the wife. She had gathered the poles herself. She had woven the brush covering with her own hands. She had chosen the ground and laid the foundation. Goodwin documented this in detail among the Western Apache and the pattern held among the Chiricahua. The wife was not living in her husband's house. The husband was living in hers. Every person in that camp knew it. Then there was divorce. A wife, first or second, could end the marriage by placing the husband's belongings outside the wickiup door. His weapons, his few personal items. Set them on the ground, and everyone understood. The marriage was finished. No hearing, no petition, no priest, no waiting period, no permission from anyone, not the husband, not a chief, not any authority at all. The husband gathered his things and walked back to his own mother's camp. The children stayed with their mother because children in Apache society belonged to the mother's line, not the father's. Opler recorded this from multiple informants across separate interviews. Every account was consistent. The wife held the door, and she could shut it whenever she decided the marriage no longer served her. A woman in an Apache camp in 1850 could end her marriage in an afternoon by setting a man's things in the dirt. Now compare that to what a white American wife faced under the same sky. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married white woman on the frontier could not own property in her own name. She could not sign a contract. She could not keep her own wages if she somehow earned any. Her legal identity ceased to exist the moment she said her vows. Everything she brought into the marriage became his under the law. Everything she earned during the marriage was his. The house she lived in, the crops she tended, the chickens she raised, the butter she churned and sold at market, all belonged to her husband. If she wanted out, she had to petition a court, or, in some states, an actual legislature. She needed legal grounds the judge would accept, and those grounds varied wildly from state to state. She needed money for lawyers and filing fees, money the law said she could not hold in her own name. And even if she succeeded, after months or years of effort, the social stigma of being a divorced woman in 19th century America could follow her to the grave. Neighbors talked, churches closed their doors, suitors vanished. An Apache second wife in 1850 had property ownership and what amounted to no-fault divorce. A white wife in 1850 had neither. That is not interpretation. That is the legal record of both systems placed side by side. One system let a woman walk away with her home and her children intact. The other system made walking away nearly impossible and punished her for trying. And one more thing the movies got backward. Hollywood loved the image of the Apache husband handing over horses to buy a wife. The bride price. It made the arrangement look like a livestock sale, a transaction at an auction. But look at how it actually worked. The gifts went to the wife's parents, not to the wife, as a bond of obligation between two families. It was a public act, witnessed by the camp, and it created mutual expectations that lasted the duration of the marriage. The wife's family could refuse the offer. They did refuse regularly if the man was lazy, if his reputation was poor, or if they simply did not want him in their circle. And if the husband later mistreated their daughter, the wife's family could demand those gifts returned. They had standing to intervene in the marriage at any point. The bride price was not a sale. It was a contract with enforcement built in, and the enforcement ran in the wife's direction. If anything, it gave her family permanent leverage over the husband. That is the exact opposite of what every Western you have watched told you was happening. The question white observers always asked when they encountered Apache plural marriage was whether the wives were jealous of each other. It fascinated them. They could not get past it. And the Apache answer, given over and over to anyone who actually listened, was always the same. The wives were usually sisters. What exactly was there to be jealous about? The daily life of a two-wife household was organized around dividing the work that would have broken one woman alone. One wife might spend the morning scraping a deer hide while the other hauled water and gathered firewood. One tended the roasting pit while the other watched the children or ground dried mezcal on a flat stone. The tasks rotated with the season and the weather. There was no fixed rank between the wives. The first wife did not give orders to the second. The work was shared because sharing it was the entire reason the second marriage existed in the first place. And here is the detail that should stop you. Multiple informants told Opler independently and without prompting that women in plural marriages said their lives were easier than the lives of women married alone. Not harder, easier. They had company during the long, grinding hours of hide work. They had someone to watch the children while they gathered food away from camp. They had a partner who understood the rhythm of the household because she had grown up inside it, a sister who had been sharing this same labor beside the same mother since childhood. The picture of the miserable second wife suffering in silence that the movies planted in your mind is a projection from the outside. The women who lived inside this system and spoke about it decades later described something much closer to relief. The domestic arrangements were understood by everyone and carried no secrecy or shame. Each wife maintained her own wickiup. The husband moved between them on a pattern the household recognized. This was the ordinary architecture of a family that functioned, not a scandal hidden behind closed doors. Visitors to the camp would have seen two wickiups standing near each other, smoke rising from both cook fires, children running between the two doorways. It looked like what it was, a family. Conflict did exist. Opler was honest about that, and the record deserves the same honesty. He recorded accounts of jealousy and resentment, sharp words exchanged over small slights that built into larger grievances. The trouble appeared most often when the second wife was not the first wife's sister. A non-sororal marriage brought an outsider into a tight family circle, a woman with different habits, a different mother, a different set of loyalties. That carried real risk, and everyone knew it, which is exactly why the sororal form was encouraged and preferred. The system had a built-in safeguard against its own failure, and the safeguard was blood. But the way conflicts were resolved tells you where the real power sat. The mother-in-law stepped in. The wider circle of female relatives weighed in. The dispute was settled inside the family, by the women. The husband was often the least important voice in the argument. He lived in their camp. He stood on their ground. He could not so much as look his mother-in-law in the face. What authority was he going to claim? When white Americans encountered all of this, they got it backward. Military officers saw a man with two wives and wrote the word harem in their reports. Indian agents described Apache women as beasts of burden. Captivity narratives painted Apache domestic life as savage and degrading. Every one of these observers saw women doing hard physical labor, hauling water, scraping hides, bending over roasting pits in the heat. And everyone made the same mistake. They assumed visible hard work meant subjugation. It never occurred to them that the woman hauling water owned the wickiup she was walking back to. It never crossed their minds that she could end her marriage before sundown. They wrote down what they expected to see, and the version they wrote became the version the country believed for the next 100 years. The United States government did not just take Apache land. It dismantled the marriage system that organized Apache life and replaced it with nothing that worked as well. In 1883, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Hiram Price established the Courts of Indian Offenses. The instructions were explicit, and they survive in the written record for anyone to read today. Suppress plural marriage. Suppress traditional dances and ceremonies. Suppress the influence of medicine men and traditional leaders. Agents on the Mescalero Reservation, at San Carlos, and at Fort Apache were ordered to enforce these directives with every tool available to them. And the tool that cut deepest was the one tied directly to whether families lived or starved: rations. By the reservation period, Apache families depended on government-issued food to survive. The old hunting grounds were fenced and closed. The game that had sustained generations was gone or scattered. Movement off the reservation was forbidden without a pass from the agent. A family that did not appear at the agency building on ration day to collect its weekly allotment of beef, flour, sugar, and coffee did not eat. There was no alternative. There was no appeal. And the agents made the terms as simple as a closed fist. A man who refused to give up his second wife would have his family's rations withheld, not reduced, not delayed, withheld entirely. Think about what that meant for the people on the ground. Second wives who had lived in stable, functioning households for 10 or 20 years were forced out. Women who had raised children, processed food, maintained wickiups through drought and winter, who had kept families alive through seasons when keeping alive was the entire challenge, were told their marriages were criminal acts. Children who had grown up with two mothers lost one by government order. The family unit that had functioned as a single economic engine, the very structure that distributed labor and kept people fed and sheltered, was cracked in half by a line in an agency report. One bureaucrat's signature, and a household that worked became two households that could not feed themselves. Then came the Dawes Act in 1887. The General Allotment Act divided reservation land into individual plots and assigned them to male heads of household. With a single piece of legislation, Congress overwrote the matrilocal foundation that had organized Apache domestic life for as far back as memory reached. Apache women who had owned the domestic space, who had built the wickiup with their own hands, who had controlled the food supply and the stored goods, who had decided which men could stay and which men had to leave, were now legally invisible on paper. The land allotment went to the husband. The title went to the husband. The woman who had been the center of the entire system was written out of it by a law she had no voice in writing and no power to oppose. A woman who had spent her life building wickiups, storing food, and managing a household that fed a dozen people now stood on ground that belonged to her husband on paper. If he died, the allotment could pass to someone else entirely. If the marriage failed, she had no claim to the land she lived on, no matter how many years she had worked it. The system that had protected her, the mother's line, the family cluster, the property she held by right and custom, had been replaced by a single sheet of government paper with a man's name on it. And here is the part that should stay with you long after this video ends. The same government that denied white women the right to vote, that stripped married white women of property rights under the doctrine of coverture, that would not pass full married women's property legislation across all states until much later in the 19th century, that very same government looked at a native system where women already held property, already controlled divorce, already anchored the domestic economy with their own labor and their own authority, and called it primitive. They called it savage. They called it uncivilized. They destroyed it in the name of civilization and imposed their own model in its place. A model that gave women less power, not more, less security, not more, less standing in their own homes, not more. And they never once paused to consider the contradiction. Or, if they did consider it, they did not care enough to let it stop them. Now I have to be honest with you about the limits of what we actually know, because this audience deserves that honesty. Almost everything we know about Apache marriage customs comes from oral history recorded after the reservation system had already crushed the old ways. The people Morris Opler sat with in the 1930s were elderly Chiricahua men and women remembering childhoods from the 1870s and 1880s. They were reaching back 50 and 60 years into a world that had already been taken from them. Eve Ball's interviews were conducted even later, from the 1950s through the 1970s, with Mescalero elders whose memories stretched through one or two more generations of retelling before they reached the days being described. Geronimo's autobiography was dictated through an Apache translator named Daklugie, then arranged and edited by Barrett, a white superintendent of education with his own assumptions about what was important and what could be left out. These are the best sources we have. They are also, for all practical purposes, the only sources we have from inside Apache life. And they are memory, not transcription. No outside observer was sitting inside a Chiricahua camp in 1845 with a notebook writing down how the second wife felt about her place in the family. No one recorded the private conversation between sisters after the husband had walked to the other wickiup for the night. The ethnographic record gives us the structure, the rules, the expectations, the visible framework of how things were supposed to work. It does not give us the unspoken thought. It does not give us the feeling that a woman carried but never said aloud to the researcher who came asking questions half a century after the world she was describing had been dismantled. But here is what the record does confirm, and it confirms it consistently across multiple independent sources who worked with different Apache communities in different decades and had no contact with each other's findings. The matrilocal residence pattern, the wife's property ownership, divorce by removal, the sororal preference, the mother-in-law's authority over the domestic sphere. These features appear in Opler and in Goodwin and in Ball and in Geronimo's own words. They are not one old man's fading memory of how things might have been. They are structural elements confirmed by every serious researcher who ever sat with Apache people and asked how their families worked. The pattern holds whether you are looking at the Chiricahua or the Western Apache or the Mescalero. It holds whether the interview took place in 1906 or 1975. That is not proof beyond all doubt. Nothing in this kind of history ever reaches that standard, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But it is as close to solid ground as we will ever stand on. And it is far more solid than anything Hollywood ever consulted before it put its own version on the screen. So who built the version you grew up with? 3 hands shaped it, and none of them belonged to an Apache. The captivity narratives came first. Throughout the 1800s, white captives and their ghostwriters published accounts of life among the Apache that were read across the country and across the ocean. Every one of those accounts described Apache women the same way. Drudges, slaves, beasts bent under impossible loads while their husbands sat idle in the shade, and every one of those accounts missed the same things. The property rights, the divorce power, the matrilocal authority that put the wife's mother, not the husband, at the center of every domestic decision. These writers saw women doing hard physical labor, hauling water up a hillside, scraping hides in the sun, digging mescal crowns in rocky ground, and they assumed that visible physical work meant subjugation. It was all they knew how to see. They could not imagine that the woman scraping that hide owned the wickiup behind her, controlled the food stored inside it, and held the power to send her husband back to his mother before dark. They projected white assumptions about gender onto a system that ran on entirely different principles, and what they wrote down became the first draft of a national story that would last for over a century. Then Hollywood arrived and finished the job. In 1950, the film Broken Arrow put Jimmy Stewart on screen opposite an Apache woman named Sonsiare, who existed only to be beautiful, to fall in love, and to die so the white hero could grieve nobly. She had no property, no family authority, no mother-in-law looming in the background with the power to reshape her marriage. In 1954, a film simply called Apache gave Burt Lancaster an Apache love interest who was brave and loyal and absolutely silent about the social system she supposedly lived inside. Not a single major Western of that era depicted Apache marriage the way it actually functioned. The second wife does not appear in Hollywood's version of the Apache world. She was written out completely because her existence would have complicated the story past what any screenwriter wanted to deal with. And behind the movies stood decades of dime novels and paperback westerns that repeated the same lazy image until it felt like common knowledge. The chief who pays horses for a bride, the silent woman with no voice and no agency, the wife as property. No novelist ever consulted Opler's fieldwork. No screenwriter ever opened Goodwin's research. The image they built was invented from nothing, and it was repeated so many times across so many pages and screens that people stopped asking whether it had ever been true. And the invention served a purpose. A people whose women held property, initiated divorce, controlled the domestic economy, and wielded authority through their mothers and sisters did not fit the narrative that justified taking their land and dismantling their families by force. The myth-makers needed Apache marriage to look primitive. They needed the second wife to be a victim, because if she was not a victim, then the entire project of civilizing her people lost its justification. So they made her a victim on the page and on the screen, and the real women vanished behind the version that served the conqueror's story. So let me answer the question I asked at the very beginning. Was the Apache second wife the victim Hollywood always showed you? She was not. She lived inside a system that gave her property she owned outright, a family network that backed her in every dispute, and a door she controlled completely. She could end her marriage in an afternoon without asking any man's permission. She could keep her home, her food, her children, and her standing in the community. These were protections that white American women living on the same frontier in the same century under the same sky did not have. The law that governed white marriage in 1850 gave a woman less autonomy than the customs that governed Apache marriage in that same year. That is not opinion. That is the documented record of both systems held up to the light. The real victim of this story was not the second wife inside the system. It was every Apache woman who had the system taken from her by men who could not see what they were destroying. A clerk in Washington in 1883 signed an order, and a way of life that had sustained families for generations was classified as criminal. The women who had owned their homes were made dependents. The mothers who had decided who stayed and who left were handed ration cards in place of authority, and the model forced on them gave them less power, not more, less security, less standing. Nothing but a set of rules written by men who never asked a single Apache woman how her family actually worked. Today, we talk about property rights and no-fault divorce as if someone invented them recently. An Apache woman standing outside her wickiup in 1850 knew them by a different name. She would not have called them breakthroughs. She would have called them ordinary life. The house was hers. The children were hers. And when the marriage no longer served her, she set his things outside the door and walked back into a home that had never stopped being hers.